Montana Territory, July 1883. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and desperate endings as Florence Ashwood stepped down from the porch of the only home she had ever known, boots crunching over the dust-swept ground. Her father's ranch, Ashwood Acres, was quiet now. No ranch hands, no cattle, no future. Just empty barns and a sagging house barely holding to its timbers. She clutched the letter from the bank tighter in her hand. The words burned into her mind. Final notice. Property to be auctioned August 1st. She was 23, alone, and out of time. Her father had passed that winter, pneumonia stealing him in 3 hard nights. Debts he had hidden for years had surfaced like rot. With no brothers, no husband, and barely enough money to feed her horse, Florence had spent the last 3 months trying to hold it together. But the bank had no patience for sentiment. She walked out beyond the old corral, past the withered fence line. That fence had once held over 300 head of cattle. Now it held nothing but ghosts. A rider appeared on the horizon, cutting across the dry hills with easy grace. Florence narrowed her eyes beneath the brim of her hat, hand resting on the small Colt holstered at her hip. Folks did not ride out this way without reason. The rider slowed as he approached, dismounted without a word, and stood watching her. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face shaded by a dusty black hat. He looked like he belonged to the land's sun-leathered skin. Quiet eyes, no wasted movement. He did not speak, just tipped his hat. Florence took a cautious step forward. "Can I help you?" He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. No name, no introduction. Just held it out. She took it with stiff fingers, unfolded it, and scanned the words. A notice of auction. Her land. Her home. Date confirmed. Location, courthouse in Billings. She looked up, throat tight. "I know. I got my own copy." He nodded once. "You ride all this way just to remind me?" He did not answer. Florence frowned. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a long moment, then finally said, voice low and steady, "Gideon Thorne." The name rang like a bell in the back of her mind. A ranch hand once told stories about a cowboy with that name, quiet as smoke, fast with a rifle, and mean with anyone who crossed a line. But not cruel. Just cut from stone. Florence crossed her arms. "Well, Gideon Thorne, I appreciate the warning, but I got enough reminders of my misery without strangers showing up to deliver more." He blinked slowly, then glanced at the house. She followed his gaze. The roof sagged on one side. Paint had long since peeled. The porch steps groaned in the wind. He met her eyes again. "I can help." Her breath caught. "How?" "I have money." She stared at him. "Why would you help me? We have never met." He looked at her then like he had known her his whole life. "I knew your father." She went still. "You worked for him?" "No. Fought beside him." Missouri, 1864. Her throat tightened. Her father never mentioned much about the war, only that he had left a part of himself behind and never got it back. Florence stepped back a pace. "Even if you knew him, that does not explain why you would ride here. Offer to pay off a stranger's debts." Gideon's jaw moved once, like he chewed on a thought. "I owe him. He saved my life. Twice." She looked away, wind tugging at her hair. "You could have just let the bank handle it. It is not your problem." He nodded. "Could have." Silence stretched between them. A hawk cried in the distance. Florence shook her head. "I do not want charity. I am not offering that." "Then what are you offering?" He held her gaze. "A deal." She hesitated. "What kind of deal?" "I buy the land. You stay. Run it. Your name stays on the gate. You keep living here. I help repair it. Bring in cattle. Sell what we raise." Her lips parted. "You want to partner with me?" He nodded once. She stared, heart pounding. "Why?" He looked down, then back up. "Because you are not a stranger. You are his daughter." Her eyes burned. She looked away before he could see too much. Most men would not risk money on a dying ranch. "I am not most men." She believed that. Florence crossed her arms. "And what if I say no? Then I ride on." She studied his face. Weathered, unreadable, but not cold. Somewhere in those quiet eyes was the weight of things left unsaid. She exhaled. "I will think about it." He nodded. "I will be back tomorrow." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. Florence stood there long after the dust settled. The next morning, he returned like he said he would. They sat at the kitchen table, ink drying on the agreement. No lawyers. Just 2 names, 2 signatures, and a promise. By the end of the week, Gideon had moved into the small bunkhouse near the barn. He said little, but worked hard fixing fences, hauling water, patching the roof. He did not ask questions. He did not push. But he showed up, every day, like clockwork. Florence found herself watching him more than she should. The way he moved quiet and sure. The way he never complained, even when blisters bled through his gloves. He would hand her tools, or steady a ladder, or bring her water without being asked. Small things. Steady things. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the fields gold, they sat on the porch, boots up on the rail. She handed him a tin cup of coffee. He took it with a nod. She looked out at the land. I did not think anyone would ever give a damn about this place again. He sipped. I do. That was all he said. But it landed like thunder in her chest. Florence looked at him, really looked. Not just at his hands, calloused and sure, or the scar that ran beneath his right cheekbone, but the way he sat beside her. Quiet, but present. A man who said little, but meant every word. I think you saved me, she said, voice low. He shook his head. Just kept a promise. She smiled, soft and real. Still, feels like saving. He looked at her then, and something passed between them. Not rushed, not loud, just a steady warmth, like a fire catching. And for the first time in months, Florence felt hope settle in her chest like a seed that might grow. By late August, the mornings came cooler, with a hush in the air that whispered of autumn's slow approach. Mist pooled low across the grasslands, and the horse's breath steamed like smoke in the dawn. Florence stood at the edge of the pasture, arms folded, watching the young roan gelding Gideon had traded 2 rifles and a saddle blanket for. The animal was lean but sound, and already responding to her voice. They called him Birch. Behind her, the bunkhouse door creaked open. She didn't turn. That horse is half wild, she said. Gideon stepped beside her, holding a ration of oats in a tin pail. So was I once. She glanced sideways. You still might be. He didn't answer, just walked into the pasture, slow and quiet, like he was stepping into church. Birch flicked his ears, but didn't bolt. Gideon crouched, poured out half the oats, and waited. The horse came to him like it was always meant to. Florence lifted her chin. How'd you learn that? Horse doesn't trust your hands if your body lies. She let that sit a moment, then said, You ever lie? Not with my body. That made her grin, despite herself. Later, she found him in the barn loft, mending tack by lantern light. She climbed the ladder, boots thudding against the rungs, and sat across from him on a hay bale. The air was thick with the scent of leather and old hay. Gideon threaded a needle through a cracked stirrup strap, slow and steady. You ever think about leaving? She asked. He didn't look up. I've already left too many places. This one's broke. He tied off the thread, tested the mended leather. So was I once. She leaned back on her elbows. You keep saying that. Only when it's true. She watched him a long while. You don't sleep much. Don't need to. Is that from the war? He paused. Partly. You have family? No, none. He kept his eyes on the leather. Had a sister. Before. She shifted. What happened? He set the stirrup aside. She died. Fever. I was off fighting. Florence's voice softened. I'm sorry. He gave a small nod. It's what made me stop riding with the army. I came back too late. They sat in silence, the lantern's flame swaying gently. Florence didn't press. She just let the quiet fill the space between them. After a while, he said, Your mother? Gone before I could remember. My father raised me. You stayed with him through it all. I didn't know anything else. You could have left. There was always something that still needed doing. He looked at her then, and she felt it in her spine, the weight of being seen without speaking a word. In September, they drove the first 20 head of cattle back from a neighboring rancher who owed Florence's father an old favor. The animals were thin but healthy. Gideon rode the flank, rifle across his lap, eyes always scanning the horizon. Florence rode lead, her hat pulled low, hair braided tight against the wind. They made camp near the river that night. She cooked beans and salt pork over a low fire while he cleaned his rifle with methodical care. You always this quiet? He poked the cleaning cloth through the barrel. Only when there's nothing worth saying. And when there is, I say it. She passed him a tin plate. Hasn't happened yet, then? He took it, met her eyes. It has. They ate in silence. The sky above them stretched wide and black, stars burning through like embers. Florence wrapped her arms around her knees, watching the fire. "I used to think I'd leave Montana someday," she said. "Why didn't you?" "Something always pulled me back." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Still feel the pull." She looked at him, the firelight carving soft gold into his face. "Not the same way." "Not anymore." He didn't answer, but she saw something shift in his eyes. Not a change, just a deepening. When they returned to the ranch, the wind had turned sharper, and the cottonwoods had begun to yellow. One morning, she found a stack of cedar planks laid out beside the barn. He'd cut them himself, hauled them from the ridge. "What's this?" He ran a hand over the top board. "Thought the porch could use a new floor." Her brows lifted. "You building it for the house, or for yourself?" He didn't look up. "For whatever comes next." She helped him lay the boards. They worked side by side, hammer and nail, sweat darkening their shirts. He didn't speak much, but when she asked him to pass a tool, his hand brushed hers just long enough to hold her there. And she didn't let go right away. By the time the last board was nailed down, the sun had started to fall. They stood back, looking at their work. Florence crossed her arms. "You ever build something permanent before?" He glanced at her. "No," she tilted her head. "Then why now?" He didn't answer, just looked at her, long enough that she felt the answer somewhere deep in her bones. That night, as she stepped inside the house, she paused at the door. "You coming in?" Gideon stood at the bottom step, hat in his hands. "Only if I'm welcome." She held the door open. "You are." He stepped through. The first frost came in the night, quiet and silver, laying a thin veil across the valley floor. Florence woke to the bite of cold air slipping through the window panes and the scent of wood smoke rising from the stove Gideon had lit before dawn. She found him outside, splitting kindling behind the barn, steam curling off his shoulders with every swing of the axe. She leaned against the doorframe, arms tucked tight into her shawl. "You always work before breakfast?" He didn't pause. "Only if the morning needs it." She watched the clean rhythm of his motion, the way the blade sank true each time. "You ever get tired?" He set the axe aside, breath even. "Not in the way that matters." She stepped down into the yard. "You don't say much about what matters." "I say enough." She crossed her arms, not from cold. "You ever want more than this?" He looked at her then, not answering right away. "Depends what this means." Florence's boot brushed against a stone in the yard. "You've done a lot for this place." "For me. I still don't know what you want out of it." "I wanted to see it stand again. I wanted to see you stay." Her breath caught, just slightly. He picked up the axe and leaned it against the shed wall, then turned toward the house. "You should eat. It's too cold to skip meals." She didn't follow right away. That afternoon, they rode out together to check the south fence line, where a pair of young bulls had started testing the wire. The ride took them deep into the hills, where the wind moved through the grass like water and the clouds dragged low enough to touch. At the top of the ridge, they dismounted. Gideon crouched beside a snapped post, running his hand along the splintered edge. "They'll keep pushing if they know it'll give," he said. Florence knelt beside him. "You ever think that's true for people, too?" He glanced at her hands, raw from riding. "Some people push because they don't know what else to do. And some don't push at all." He stood and began cutting a brace from a nearby cedar limb. "Not everyone needs to." They worked in quiet rhythm, hands moving without wasted words. When the post was set and the wire pulled taut, she leaned against it, catching her breath. "Did you ever want to settle somewhere before this?" He braced one foot on the bottom wire, testing the tension. "I stopped thinking about settling a long time ago." She watched him as he straightened. "And now?" His eyes were steady. "Now I think about it." The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the air turned sharp again. They rode home slow, letting the horses pick their path, hooves muffled in the tall grass. That night, Florence lit a lantern in the kitchen and stood at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sifting flour for biscuits. She heard the door open behind her, boots scraping the threshold. She didn't turn. "I was thinking," she said, voice low, "about what you said earlier." Gideon stepped into the light, his hat in his hands. "You said you wanted to see me stay." He nodded once. She met his eyes. "I want you to stay too." He didn't speak, just stepped forward, slow and sure, until he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth off him. He didn't reach for her. Just waited. Florence set the flour tin aside and wiped her hands on her apron. I've spent a long time thinking I had to carry everything alone. That if I leaned, it would all fall. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. She looked up at him, eyes rimmed with a kind of relief she hadn't known how to name. You sure you want to stay tied to a place with this much ruin in its bones? I'm not tied to the ruin, he said. I'm tied to you. Her breath left her chest like the end of a long winter. She stepped forward, letting her forehead rest lightly against his shoulder. His arms came around her, slow and careful, like she might vanish if he moved too fast. They stood like that for a long time, with only the wind outside and the low creak of the old house settling around them. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just the quiet certainty of something real taking root. Later, she placed 2 cups on the table, poured coffee thick and black, and sat across from him as the embers in the stove glowed low. The papers from the bank were gone now, burned weeks ago in the hearth. No debt, no sale. Just land that still breathed and 2 people learning to build something from what remained. Gideon reached across the table and laced his fingers through hers, rough hands warm against her calloused ones. Florence didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said what words couldn't. She'd found home again, and this time, it wasn't something she'd lose. Outside, the wind moved through the valley, soft and sure, and the stars above watched in silence. The first snow came early, dusting the ridgeline with a hush that softened the land. Horses moved slower in the morning, and the woodpile shrank faster than Florence liked. The ranch breathed in a new rhythm, now quieter, steadier. Inside the house, the windows fogged from the heat of the stove, and the scent of boiled wool and pine pitch lingered in the air. Florence hung her coat by the door and pressed the back of her hand to her temple. That new heifer's limping again. Gideon poured water into the basin. Back left. She favors it more coming in from the far slope. He nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth. Wrap it before nightfall. She won't stand another freeze. Florence pulled the kettle from the hook and set it to the side. You know, you talk more to animals than you do to people. I trust what they mean. She leaned against the table, watching him roll his sleeves. You always this wary. Only when I've got something worth keeping. She didn't answer, but a quiet warmth curled through her chest. She reached for the ledger tucked beneath the blue crock jar near the hearth. The numbers had started to make sense again. They weren't good, not yet, but they weren't bleeding anymore either. I've been thinking, she said, flipping to a fresh page. Gideon raised an eyebrow. About the east pasture. It's been resting 2 years now. If we seed it in spring, maybe barley, we could get a decent rotation going. He stepped closer, eyes on the page. Barley's hard on dry soil. It'll hold. That slope's got better drainage than the west. And if we trade for that mule from the Klein place, we could break more ground. His hand brushed the corner of the page as he pointed. You'd need a second plow. Then I'll build one. You? I watched my father piece one from scrap in a blizzard. I can manage. Gideon looked at her then, eyes resting on hers longer than usual. You don't stop. Florence closed the ledger, her voice softer now. I don't know how. He seemed to study that answer, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper. She took it, unfolding it carefully. What is this? Deed transfer. She blinked. You put the land under both our names. He nodded once. Florence stared at the document, then at him. You didn't ask. I didn't want you to think it was a favor. Her voice caught. It's not. He glanced toward the window, hands loose at his sides. Then it ought to be shared. She set the paper down gently, heart full in a way she didn't have words for yet. Do you always make decisions like that? Only when I'm sure. She stepped toward him, slow and deliberate. And are you? He met her eyes. I am. They stood close now, and the quiet between them held something solid. Florence reached up, fingers brushing the edge of his collar. You planning to keep riding out come spring? Not unless you tell me to. I won't. He lifted his hand, and it settled at her waist like it had always belonged there. Then I'll stay. Florence exhaled, the last of the doubt leaving her lungs. You've already built more here than anyone else ever did, including my father. His thumb traced the edge of her apron tie. He built the bones. We're giving it breath again. She leaned into his chest, the beat of his heart steady beneath her ear. His hand moved up to her back, anchoring her in place, and her own arms came around him without thought. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the wind whispering at the eaves. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a breath. This feels like something that's meant to last. It is. Outside, the snow deepened, covering the fences and the distant hills in a blanket of quiet promise. Inside, warmth spread between them, not from the stove, not from the fire, but from the kind of closeness that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Florence lifted her chin, and Gideon met her there, his mouth brushing hers in a kiss that held no hesitation, no question. Just a vow, silent and sure. When they drew apart, she rested her forehead to his. "We'll seed the east pasture come spring. We will. And in the summer, we'll build another lean-to for the stock." His voice was low. "And after that," she smiled, "we'll see what else this place wants to become." Gideon kissed her again, slower this time, as the snow fell steady beyond the windows and the ranch settled into a peace it hadn't known in years. By mid-December, the days shortened into quick silver slants of light, and the snow deepened into drifts tall enough to bury the fence posts out by the creek. The cattle stayed close to the feeding sheds, breath steaming in the air like ghosts. Florence rose before sunrise now, hands raw from cold and rope, feet steady in the ruts packed hard by habit. Life was quieter, but not idle. There was still much to mend, and winter asked for its due. One morning, while Gideon shoveled out the barn's northern eave, Florence stood in the root cellar, pressing her thumb into the last of the late potatoes. Most had softened. Only a few were fit to eat. She wiped her hands on her skirt and looked up the narrow stairs, where pale light filtered in through the half-open door. Later, she found Gideon in the tack room, sleeves rolled, carving a new handle for the hay hook. His hands moved with the same patience he brought to everything measured, quiet, and exact. She leaned against the doorframe and watched him a moment. "I need to ride into town," she said. He looked up. Something wrong. Barrel of flowers near empty, and the stove's burning hotter than it should. "I want to see if Martin still has that iron damper plate." Gideon set the blade down. "You planning to go alone?" She nodded. "I've done worse in worse weather." He stood and brushed the wood shavings from his palms. "I'll ride with you. I can manage." "I know. But you're coming anyway?" "Yes." She didn't argue. The weather had turned sharp again, and she'd seen the way the wind curled down from the north like a blade. They left just after midday, wrapped in wool and oilskin, the horses moving slow over the packed snow. The road to town twisted through low hills and bare cottonwoods, the creek running black and fast beside them. Florence rode ahead, hat pulled low, jaw set against the cold. Gideon followed, rifle strapped across his saddle, eyes sweeping the horizon. Billings had quieted for winter. Wagons moved slower, voices muffled behind scarves. The general store was dim and smelled of kerosene, pine soap, and old apples. Florence spoke with Martin while Gideon waited by the door, his back to the stove, arms folded. She returned with a small sack of flour, a tin of cloves for the cider, and the damper plate wrapped in burlap. She handed it to him. "You were right. He still had one." He took it without a word. As they stepped outside, the snow had begun again, light and dry, swirling in the wind like dust. They loaded the supplies and mounted up. Florence looked back at the town once, quiet in its winter hush. "You ever think of living closer to people?" she asked. "No, why not? Too many voices. Not enough truth." She adjusted the reins in her gloves. "You think truth's only found where it's quiet? I think it's easier to hear when it is." They rode home with the wind in their faces and the snow pulling long lines behind their horses. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had darkened to slate, and the windows glowed warm behind frosted glass. Inside, Florence lit the fire in the stove while Gideon unpacked the bags. She poured 2 mugs of cider and set them on the table. He sat across from her, eyes on the flames. "Do you miss who you were before the war?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, "I don't remember him well enough to miss him." She reached for his hand. "I think your sister would have liked who you became." He nodded once. "I hope so." They sat together until the fire burned low, the room wrapped in warmth and quiet. Florence leaned her head to his shoulder, and he rested his cheek atop her hair. By the end of December, the new porch was finished, and the damper plate had steadied the stove's hunger. They began planning spring rotations, sketching ideas by lantern light barley in the east slope, a second hay field behind the north ridge, and a chicken coop if the frost broke early enough. One morning, Florence found Gideon outside the barn, brushing the roan gelding with long, even strokes. She stepped beside him, arms crossed against the cold. "I've been thinking about the old loft." He looked up. "I want to clear it out. Make it something more useful. What would you put there?" She hesitated. "A cradle, maybe, if that's something you'd want." He set the brush down. "You already knew?" she asked. "I suspected." She folded her hands beneath her coat. "I wasn't sure when to say it." "You just did." He stepped forward and took her hands in his, warm and rough and steady. "I didn't think I'd get a second life," he said. "But I've got one now." She smiled up at him, eyes wet with cold and something deeper. "So do I." That spring, the barley took root. The chickens arrived in a crate from Missoula, and the coop stood painted and proud behind the barn. The cradle sat in the loft, carved from cedar, Gideon's initials burned into the bottom rail. The land no longer felt haunted by what it had lost, but blessed by what had been built anew. On the first warm day of April, Florence stood on the porch watching the wind roll through the grass. Gideon stepped behind her, arms sliding around her waist. She leaned back into him, the sun warm on her face, his breath steady at her ear. "This place is good now," she said. "It is. And we're going to be all right. We already are." She turned in his arms, her hands resting over his heart. "I love you, Gideon Thorne." His voice was soft, but sure. "And I love you, Florence Ashwood." They kissed beneath the wide Montana sky, with the barley fields just beginning to green and the river running full with meltwater. The wind carried the scent of turned earth and sweet hay, and the world felt made new again. They lived many years on that land, building it up piece by piece. Their children grew strong in the same fields Florence once thought would be lost. And through seasons of drought and plenty, snow and bloom, the house stood firm, steady with the weight of love that had taken root there. Florence and Gideon grew old together, their hands worn but always finding one another. And when they lay down each night, it was with the peace of people who had known sorrow, endured it, and chosen joy anyway. The land kept its promise, and so did they.